Wait a second. What's happening? Let's rewind. On February 4th, 1899, just 2 days before the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris, fighting broke out between American forces and Filipino nationalists led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who wanted independence rather than a change in colonial rulers. This started the Philippine-American War. After the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Islands were given to the U.S. The Filipinos refused to be controlled and fought against the U.S. Eventually, war broke out between the two, and the Philippine-American War began. The fighting didn't happen overnight. It happened due to a series of conflicting events between the U.S. and the Philippines over the Philippine struggle for independence. This was the beginning of the Philippine-American War. The fighting took place around the Philippines and Guam. The war had two phases. The first phase, from February to November of 1899, was dominated by Aguinaldo's ill-fated attempts to fight a conventional war against the better-trained and more equipped American troops. The second phase began when the Filipinos shifted to guerrilla-style warfare. This began in November of 1899 and lasted through the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901 and into the spring of 1902. At this time, most organized Filipino resistance had dissipated. The United States entered the conflict with undeniable military advantages that included a trained fighting force and a steady supply of military equipment. Meanwhile, the Filipino forces were hampered by their inability to gain any kind of outside support for their cause, chronic shortages of weapons and ammunition, and complications produced by the Philippines' geographic complexity. Under these conditions, Aguinaldo's attempt to fight a conventional war in the first few months of the conflict proved to be a fatal mistake. The Filipino army suffered severe losses in men and material before switching to the guerrilla tactics that might have been more effective if employed from the beginning of the conflict. The war was brutal on both sides. U.S. forces at times burned villages, implemented civilian reconcentration policies, and employed torture on suspected guerrillas. Filipino fighters also tortured captured soldiers. They also terrorized civilians who cooperated with U.S. forces. Many civilians died during the conflict as a result of the fighting, cholera and malaria epidemics, and food shortages caused by several agricultural catastrophes. June 4, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed a general amnesty and declared the conflict over. The war lasted 3 years. The U.S. had won, but over 4,200 Americans and over 20,000 Filipino soldiers died in combat. 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, disease, or famine. A short-term result is that under the 1902 Philippine Organic Act passed by the United States Congress, Filipinos were initially given very limited self-government, including the right to vote for elected officials such as an elected Philippine Assembly, but it was not until 14 years later, with the 1916 Philippine Autonomy Act passed by the United States Congress during the administration of the Democratic 28th President Woodrow Wilson, that the U.S. had officially promised eventual independence along with more Filipino control in the meantime over the Philippines. The 1934 Philippine Independence Act created in the following year of the Commonwealth of the Philippines, a limited form of independence, and established a process ending in Philippine independence. Finally, in 1946, following World War II and the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, the United States granted independence through the Treaty of Manila concluded between the two governments and nations.
Wow, you want to fight?
Throw up! Throw up! Throw up! Throw up! Turn over!
Enemies! Stay trooper! Oh, yeah!